I have found, and found well before Trump's election, well before we even knew about the so-called deaths of despair, premature mortality among middle-aged, less than college educated whites, was a big gap in terms of optimism among poor minorities, poor blacks in particular, and poor whites. So at the time I decided to look at differences across poor blacks, poor whites, and poor Hispanics. This was a time that there was a lot of violence in the African American community, the Ferguson riots, the Baltimore riots, a lot of concern about the state of African Americans in this country. And what I found in my data was that poor blacks were 3 times as likely to be higher up on an optimism scale than poor whites. And at the time, that finding really surprised me. Poor Hispanics were about 1.5 times as likely as poor whites to be optimistic, but nothing like the gap between poor whites and poor blacks. Poor blacks are also half as likely to report stress the previous day as poor whites, and we know objectively that they don't experience less stress. They're more resilient to it. What we're finding in the US now is that minorities, although traditionally discriminated against, starting from a lower level of life expectancy and higher levels of mortality, have continued to make gradual progress and narrowing the gap with whites. They've also done this on the education front, and so you see what were previously bigger differences in levels narrowing substantially. Our mortality rate is going up rather than down. We're the only rich country in the world where this is happening. Due to what we've called deaths of despair, Ann Case and Angus Deaton came out with a study later in 2016 that showed that there was a huge increase in premature deaths among less than college educated, middle-aged whites. These deaths, you do not see blacks or Hispanics in this category of death at all. We're seeing today a terrible convergence of events, lack of hope, loss of aversion, loss of identity, loss of purpose, loss of jobs among low-skilled workers, and particularly poor white low-skilled workers do not have another narrative. We've seen, in contrast, poor minorities have dealt with a history of discrimination, coping, have higher levels of resilience, seem to have better community ties, informal ties, and ways of coming together as communities. And even in the face of tragic and horrific events, ranging from kids in cages to mass shootings like the El Paso shooting, you see these communities, the latter set of communities, coming together and trying to push forward with a positive agenda versus a complete sort of desperation and hate driven in part by our civic discourse, by our president, by certain parts of the media. Historically, over time, we've seen that people who are losing, who fear being taken over by others, even if it's not the reality, do desperate and terrible things. We need to take this as a historical moment that we really need to come together and show that America isn't what is going on in the mainstream stories and in horrible shootings or the language that our president uses.